Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming in today, this rainy day. We have the event planned and titled as the 2016 presidential election and the Hispanic vote. Today is the Florida primaries. That's a very important state, as well as Ohio. So we couldn't have planned it better. We were just talking about how serendipitous it is to be gathered together around this topic. My name is Felipe Martinez, and I'm an assistant professor at the Hispanic Studies Department at Brown. And I want to thank, first of all the wonderful people at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the Watson Institute, especially Catherine Goldman, Richard Snyder, and Seth Stollen for hosting the event and as well making sure that everything is running smoothly. I also want to thank today's participants in the roundtable for agreeing to come and being excited about creating this space to discuss this very important issue. Welcome to Brown, all of you. I know two of the panelists are Brown students, graduated from Brown alumni. All of the panelists come from quite different fields. We have activists, scholars, journalists, but they all come together in and intersecting the topic that brings us together. That's the Hispanic presence in the elections of this year. Before I turn the microphone over to them, I want to say a few words about this year's election. As a Colombian expatriate who has been in the US for 10 years, I have had to see these elections from an unsettling distance. I feel interpellated what is said in every single presidential debate, but have no right to vote. This is the same feeling thousands of Hispanic and non-Hispanic immigrants have in this country. Nonetheless, as Ernesto Londoño wrote for the New York Times, Donald Trump has been an implausible godsend for the Hispanic community. He's bringing thousands of Latin American immigrants to seek naturalization and participate in the upcoming general elections. Naturally, to vote against him. This politicization is healthy and welcomed. And yet, reality is more complex. What about undocumented immigrants? Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio offer different narratives of what being Hispanic means. Both tackle the immigration question, quote unquote, in different ways, and none up to this point have been able to rally the support they need to win over a political force that proves decisive in states such as California, Arizona, and Florida, a pivotal state that, as you know, its primaries are taking place today, as I said earlier. Amidst an increasing violent discourse unleashed by the Trump campaign, which we all have seen broadcasted in the media every single day, peaceful, insightful debates such as the one we are holding today are more than welcome and necessary. Hispanics have had a long, fruitful presence in this country and have shared in the riches and miseries of its history. In this election, what is being disputed, it seems to me, is the size of its future. Does that future look like the post-World War II past, or does that future look uncharted and yet imaginable? Probably a future where we don't have to choose between which bodies does the American state provides shade to and which bodies does it leave without protection and solace. It is definitely a crucial moment in American history and a decisive one for Hispanics. So without further ado, I want to turn the microphone over to the participants. The format of the roundtable is pretty straightforward. Each panelist will have 10 to 15 minutes to share their thoughts. After that, we'll open the floor for questions and general discussion. I see that you're all already helping yourselves to food. The event is being live streamed, so please smile to the cameras. We have two cameras here. And we will start with Heather, then we'll go with Domingo, and then we'll go with Daniel following sort of the order of the table. Heather Silber Mohammed is an assistant professor of political science at Clark University, where she teaches courses on American politics, including Latino politics and women in politics. Professor Silber Mohammed earned her PhD here at Brown University. She also holds a master's degree from the London School of Economics. Her research interests include Latino politics, immigrant socialization and participation, immigration policy, and identity politics, with a focus on the influence of race, class, and gender. Her forthcoming book, The New Americans, Immigration, Protest, and the Politics of Latino Identity, is coming soon with the University Press of Kansas. We already did? Yeah.
It's still forthcoming.
It's still forthcoming. focuses on the 2016 immigration policy debate and the unprecedented wave of protest that this debate sparked in Latino communities across the country. She looks at the varying ways that the debate over immigration reform resonates with different subgroups of the Latino community. Before her career in academia, Heather spent 6 years working in the U.S. Congress. Join me in welcoming Heather to Brown.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Felipe, for that introduction. And thanks to the Watson Institute for having me here. It's great to be back at Brown. I've been in this room many, many times on the other side, so it's really fun to be up here. And I'd like to also thank Rich Snyder, who's not yet here, but for inviting me to participate in this panel today. So just an overview of the talk that I'm giving today. I'm going to do sort of a big picture talk about why we care about Latinos, who they are in the United States, and then some general thoughts looking at some of the polling data that we have about the primaries, thinking about the general elections, and thinking about both Latino attitudes and the very big issue of Latino turnout. So why Latinos? Why are we all here today thinking about the Latino population? In 2003, Latinos became the largest minority group in the United States. They are also becoming a very growing group in the electorate. We've seen in 1998, Latinos represented less than 4% of the electorate. By 2012, they were more than 10% of the electorate. So we see a growing influence of Latinos within the presidential elections in the United States, particularly because of their presence in swing states, right? So in the United States, we have a lot of states that are almost definitely going to be Democratic, many that are almost definitely going to be Republican, and then we have these very important swing states in the middle, and we see large groups of Latinos in many of these states, Colorado, Nevada, Florida. So we see a lot of attention focused on the Latino population and their possible influence in the outcome of electoral contests. Unlike some other minority groups, Latinos are also considered to be pretty potentially open to appeals by the Republican Party. Ronald Reagan famously said that Latinos are Republicans, they just don't know it yet. So we see, for instance, within the African American population, we see about over 80% registered as Democrats and very, very large support for President Obama, over 90% of African Americans voting for President Obama. We don't always see that same sort of cohesion within the Latino community. So in 2004, George W. Bush, who was a strong advocate of comprehensive immigration reform, he received over 40% of the Latino vote. We can contrast that with 2012, where President Obama received an all-time high of 75% of the Latino vote. But really, there's this sense that the Latino community is sort of in play, or has historically been in play politically, more than other racial and ethnic minorities. And the Latino community is not monolithic, right? So what we mean by that, we see a lot of variation within the Latino community. We hear a lot about Cuban Americans and the Cuban American Republicans. My dad actually came to the United States from Cuba in 1960. I have a lot of the famous Cuban American Republicans in my family, but you see that that is actually only 3.5% of the pie of Latinos in the United States today. So we can think about variation happening in a lot of different ways. So now connecting that to the primaries, the ongoing primary process, and what we have seen happening in U.S. politics today. So I would say, sort of despite some of the variation that we're used to seeing within the Latino community, we have seen a very, very large and overwhelming response to the language and the proposals of Donald Trump. This is from November 2015. This is from a survey conducted by Latino Decisions, which is the preeminent Latino polling firm in the United States. They found that 68% of Latinos had a very unfavorable view of Donald Trump. 12% had a somewhat unfavorable view. So this is over 80% being either somewhat unfavorable or very unfavorable, sort of despite Trump's claims that the Hispanics love him and he's gonna win the Hispanics. We see that the evidence tells us a very different story. We also have seen on the Republican side a lot of speculation about whether Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, who are both Cuban American, will reach out and will be able to capture the vote of the Latino community. There's a sense, and we have evidence in general in politics, that having a co-ethnic running for office, having someone who looks like you, in general tends to build support for those candidates. We see that not really happening so much with Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. Ted Cruz in the Senate has consistently, in his Texas elections, he's consistently only won a minority of Latino votes there. So I think there's a large sense that both Cruz and Rubio have been unable to connect with a lot of Latinos, and to some extent, we've seen, this is in part because both of these candidates have been shifting further and further to the right on immigration reform. So Marco Rubio was a strong advocate of bipartisan reform. In the Senate, he was for it before he was against it. So now we've seen both of them really coming out very strong in the Donald Trump vein about immigration. And we have also seen more generally a large shift within the Latino population in sentiment about the Republican Party. So traditionally, Latinos in the US have pretty weak partisan alliances compared to whites or African Americans. Traditionally, Latinos are reluctant to identify as either Democrat or Republican. But we can see here this huge increase in the percent of Latinos thinking that the Republican Party is hostile towards Latinos. So increasing from 18% in 2012 to 45% in 2015. And we can think about the implications for this not only in the 2016 presidential election, but also moving forward. There's some question of whether this contest might solidify partisanship within the Latino population. Thinking about the Democratic side and what's been going on the Democratic side. When Obama won office in 2008 and 2012, there was really this coalition. People refer to it as the Obama coalition. These are the demographics that combined within the Democratic Party to elect President Obama. So African Americans and Latinos, and also young voters and college-educated white women. And what's been really interesting on the Democratic side in this contest is that to some extent, we've seen the candidates sort of splitting this Obama coalition of voters, right? So we've seen African Americans and Latinos having very, very high levels of support for Hillary Clinton, young voters, college-educated white women, and particularly young college-educated white women supporting Sanders. So that's been really interesting to watch the ways in which this Obama coalition has sort of separated for the different candidates. But within the Latino community, we see very, very high levels of support for Hillary Clinton. So this is more evidence from Latino Decisions from a 2015 poll that they conducted. What this table here is showing is the net favorability rating. So basically taking the percentage of people who have favorable opinions and subtracting the people who have unfavorable opinions. So we see Hillary Clinton having 35% net favorability. She was the only candidate to have over 50% favorability among Latinos. And within that, we see Latina women having more positive attitudes towards Hillary Clinton than Latino men. So among Latinas, 68% have a favorable opinion of Hillary Clinton, 54% of Latino men. So again, mirroring to some extent what we see in the general population. And we can see much more support for the Democratic candidates here, obviously, than the Republicans. You can see some candidates up here that are no longer in the race. And we also see the negatives for Rubio and Cruz, which is pretty interesting thinking about, again, the question of whether or not Latinos will be likely to support other Hispanic candidates. This is more recent polling here from Gallup, taking another look at favorable and unfavorable ratings of Hispanics. And I just wanted to point out a few things. One is, again, the very, very high favorable ratings of Hillary Clinton, so 59%. She also has relatively high unfavorable ratings, but she still has the highest net favorable of the candidates. In terms of the Democratic side, we also see high lack of familiarity with Bernie Sanders, right? So there's some question of whether if Sanders' message continues to spread, if people in the Latino population continue to hear more about what Sanders has to say, whether support for his candidacy may at some point increase, right? So 51%, again, being unfamiliar, that suggests that there's potentially some room for that. 49% having no opinion. Then when we look down at Donald Trump, we see, again, these huge unfavorable ratings, right? 77% have an unfavorable rating of Donald Trump. We hear a lot of talk lately about John Kasich as potentially being coming out of a brokered convention, maybe as a potential alternative to Trump or Cruz. And we see, again, very high unfamiliarity ratings with Kasich. So 71% of Latinos still have no opinion of John Kasich, right? So overall, I think this is suggesting a lot of support for Democratic candidates, but also a lot of unknowns within the Latino population. And I think I just want to close by saying that the biggest unknown really is this question of turnout. So when we think about the Latino population and who Latinos will support, we also have to frame that in the larger context of low Latino turnout. So I personally have studied Latino politics for over a decade, and every single election that I have looked at, everyone talks about the Latino sleeping giant. And is the sleeping giant going to wake up? This is a reference to the low level of turnout within the Latino population, right? So we see here within the white population, within the African American population, we see turnout typically between 60 and 70%. Within the Latino population, I have Asian Americans up here as well, turnout is typically between 40 and 50%. So much, much lower rates than we see with other racial and ethnic groups. And again, every presidential election, there's been this question, will the Latino giant, the sleeping giant, wake up? It hasn't happened yet. I think arguably for a number of reasons, the Latino community is positioning itself for this time around. So some of what Felipe mentioned in the beginning, we've seen many, many anecdotal reports of Latinos who are eligible to naturalize, starting the naturalization process so that they can vote against Donald Trump. We've seen lots of press coverage of record-breaking efforts. So last week, there was a story in the New York Times about $15 million being spent on a super PAC to mobilize Latino voters. George Soros himself has contributed about $5 million to this effort. That organization says they have a goal of reaching out to over 700,000 Latinos and Asian Americans and knocking on their doors and encouraging them to go to the polls. And we know from research that minority communities, Latinos and Asian Americans, respond tremendously to these efforts. So we see in experiments where people have our canvas, someone knocks on their door and tells them to go vote, we see double-digit increases in turnout within the Latino and Asian American population. So I think these efforts are setting us up for a big increase in turnout, but I would say, like almost anything with this election, all bets are kind of off. It's really too soon to say what will actually happen. So thank you.
Sorry if you said this, but is that percent of eligible voters or total population?
Eligible voters.
Our next speaker, thank you, Heather. Our next speaker is Domingo Morel. He's a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at Wellesley College. His research focuses on racial and ethnic politics, urban politics, education politics, politics of inequality, and public policy. He's currently working on a book manuscript that examines the emergence of state takeovers of local governments in the U.S. and their effects on Black and Latino political empowerment. He's co-founder and co-chair of the Latino Policy Institute at the Roger Williams University, and is past president of the Rhode Island Latino Political Action Committee. He received his PhD in political science from Brown University in 2014. Welcome, Domingo, to Brown. Welcome back.
Okay. Well, thank you, Felipe, for the introduction. Thank you for all of you being here. Professor Susan Moffin, who was my advisor while I was a student here. So happy to see you in the audience. It's really nice to be back at Brown, and what a great time to talk about presidential politics and Latino politics in our country. Not only is it yeah, you see the Donald Trump face. I had to, out of all the pictures I had to pick, that one looked most fitting, right? So, and that's where I'm going to begin our conversation today. Is about Donald Trump, like most of us have been doing, study politics. And I think that the Donald Trump campaign is helpful, in some ways, understand the power of the Latino electorate beyond turnout, right? Beyond voter registration. And as we can see from this picture here, this is from Chicago, the protest at the University of Illinois Chicago campus, where students gathered to protest the Donald Trump campaign, and led the Donald Trump campaign to cancel the talk, to cancel the rally. And some have drawn parallels to the 1968 Democratic National Convention, where students mostly protested, and tried to derail that convention. And there may be some parallels here, and if there's some people in the audience who study this, you may be able to draw parallels, but I want to suggest that there are very little similarities between 1968 and what just happened this past Friday, and is likely to increase happening over time. And one of the major reasons why there's a significant difference is because in 1968, the Latino population in the United States was very small. And the Latino population, the Latino electorate, had very little to do with what happened in 1968. And so if we look at over time, roughly that time, 1970, we had 9.6 million Latinos in the U.S. Currently, we have about 55 million Latinos in the U.S. And it is very difficult, I would argue impossible, to understand the rise of Donald Trump without understanding the emergence of the Latino population in the United States, right? And so this 55 million has a lot to do with that. And in fact, if we look at the protests in Chicago, this picture here looks like these two individuals are, kind of fighting. They're really not. They're celebrating. They really are. They're celebrating. And the protests were organized by Latino student groups, African American student groups, and Muslim student groups in Chicago. And so this right here is a Latino student. I don't know if you could tell from there, but he has a Mexican national flag, and an African American celebrating this, that they were able to stop Donald Trump. And so this tells us a story about Latino political mobilization that is not really captured in terms of registration, in terms of voter turnout. It talks about mobilization, protest, and how that part of the Latino experience can shape our politics. And this is one way where it's happening. Last week, I believe it was last week, Univision had a debate, took place in Florida, and I thought it was something fascinating. I think it didn't gain enough attention. Both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders went on record saying that they're not going to deport children, pushed by Jorge Ramos to do this. And yes, voter registration definitely has something to do with it, but also mobilization and people protesting for many, many years, the Dreamers and others, and the push against Obama efforts to deport undocumented immigrants, that all has worked its way to our discourse around 2016 presidential election as they relate to Latinos. And so this is important because, and I wanted to spend some time talking about the protest, the community organizing element of this, because if we just focus on the electoral aspects of Latino and their impact on the 2016 election, we missed out a big story here. And the reason why is, today, at the end of today, the primary contest might actually be over. For the Republicans, Donald Trump may be the nominee, and it's possible that Hillary Clinton becomes the nominee by the end of today. And if that is the case, then states like California, where we have high numbers of Latinos, states like New York, where we have a high number of Latinos, they won't even really have a chance to influence the primary process, because California doesn't have a primary until June. By then, it's probably going to be decided for the Democrats, right? So if we don't take into account the community organizing, the protest that takes place among Latinos and how they have been able to influence and shape our discourse, then we don't really capture their influence in our electoral politics. And so I wanted to make sure that we discuss that, to then pivot to this discussion about the battleground states, because pretty soon I think that we're going to see this pivot. Like I said, by the end of today, the nominating process might actually be settled for Democrats and Republicans in the primary elections. As we pivot to the general election, here we see in yellow the states that are considered toss-up states or battleground states, right? But then there's also those states that lean Democratic and those states that lean Republican. We see some of these toss-up states, Nevada, Colorado, Virginia, and absolutely Florida. Maybe not so much New Hampshire and Iowa, a little bit Ohio. But these states are going to be influenced by the electoral participation of Latinos, particularly Nevada and Colorado, and definitely the state of Florida. And so if we live in Rhode Island, like most of us here do, you live in Texas, you live in California, you're not going to see a presidential candidate come and visit you after the nominating process is over. They're just not going to go. They're going to be in these particular states, these battleground states. And Latinos are going to have the potential to influence these elections in some significant ways. And the one state that I think is most intriguing, and I want to spend some time talking about today, and obviously we could talk more about this during our Q&A, is, and I'll go back to that in a second, is the state of Florida. So state of Florida gets a lot of attention. State of Florida today has its primaries, and because, as Heather mentioned, the presence of the Cuban American population there, strongly Republican since the 1980s, since the Ronald Reagan years, that is completely changing. So today, Cubans make up 31% of the electorate, of the Latino electorate in Florida, compared to 46% in 1990. And not only is the size of the Cuban population decreasing as a share of the Latino electorate in Florida, but within the Cuban population, their views are changing as well. And so we see younger Cubans really having a different take on travel to Cuba, for example, and support for Rubio, for example. Rubio more closely aligned with what the older generation of Cubans probably, in terms of ideology, in terms of policy towards the island of Cuba. We see that changing. And so this has a significant potential effect on what we see happening in the elections, because it might be that Latinos in the state of Florida will no longer be solid Republican. In fact, that's not the case any longer. If we see registration among Latinos in the state of Florida, back in 2006, these are all in thousands, right? So we had, for the Republican Party, about 414,000 registered Latino voters. And that remains relatively steady since 2006. But look at the registration among Latinos for the Democratic Party. That has increased dramatically, as has the no party affiliation. And as Heather was mentioning, Latinos, historically have been kind of reluctant to declare one party over the other. In lieu of that, this is pretty significant. So number one, Latino registration in the Democratic Party has increased significantly, and so has no party affiliation, while the Republicans have remained pretty steady. And as this slide here shows, so candidates that have won the state of Florida, nine out of the last 10 presidential elections have won that presidential election. So the state of Florida is going to be key. And if Latinos indeed shift the way that we think they're going to shift from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, then is really problematic for the Republican Party nationally. The other, so as Heather also mentioned, you're thinking beyond 2016. So here's some things that, some numbers that are pretty staggering, right? So each month, 50,000 Latinos turn 18 in the United States. Median age is 27. So for the time being, that may work against Latinos. We know that Latinos, as Heather pointed out, don't turn out to vote in high numbers compared to African American Latinos. Part of the reason is because they're younger, and younger voters tend to vote less, turn out less than older voters. It's this Bernie Sanders problem. He has a lot of people supporting him, the young people supporting him, they just don't vote in high numbers, right? So right now, this may be problematic for Latinos that they're so young compared to the rest of the population. But 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and Latinos at this rate of turning 18, we might see a significant shift in the power of the Latino electorate. And just one example, in North Carolina, in 2004, there were 10,000 Latino registered voters. By 2012, there were 114,000. And the Latino community, Latino population is growing in places that oftentimes we don't think they're growing. And these states in the South, so we look at Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, and so forth, Mississippi. If the Latino population continues to increase the way that we think it's going to continue to increase, then this electorate changes dramatically. The South, which has been essential to the Republican Party, may be transforming. And so when we think about this existential question that issue that the Republican Party has, and how Donald Trump may really be problematic beyond 2016, this may be an indication why. That if Latinos turn from potentially Republican to solid Democratic, the Republican Party has a big problem. And that's about it. We could take this to the roundtable. Thank you.
And last but not least, Daniel Denver. He's a reporter at Salon, where he covers politics, criminal justice, and immigration. Daniel is a former reporter at Philadelphia City Paper and the Atlantic City Lab. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Vice, and many other publications. Welcome, Daniel. You can also have it.
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, I don't have a PowerPoint, so sadly you will have to either look at me or at your sandwiches or something else, but not at the screen. Latinos are obviously playing a really big role in this election, both as protagonists and sort of unfortunately as political objects of fear on the Republican side, at least. Obviously, it seems as though Donald Trump's anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-Mexican, and sort of quasi-fascist, something kind of akin to a European right nationalist party, those sort of politics have the prospects, as the two prior speakers have mentioned, to mobilize a lot of Latino voters in the general election. It's unclear whether it will be truly waking the sleeping giant, but I think that there's a decent chance that we could see a historic turnout. I want to talk a little bit about what I think Trump is doing with his anti-immigrant language. It's basically, I would argue, a matter of security. His whole campaign, in a sense, is about a fortress America that's safe both economically and physically. When it comes to Latino immigrants, the first and kind of basic idea that's more kind of been around for a while in United States politics is the idea that Latino immigrants in general and Mexican immigrants in particular are taking American jobs. The second, as Trump phrased it, is that Mexicans are rapists and murderers, and some of them, he's sure, are nice people, he added at the end. As a quick aside, something really weird that isn't much commented on about Trump's theory about Mexican immigration is that he's actually not saying that Mexicans as a whole are rapists and murderers. He's actually arguing that there's a conspiracy on the part of like super geniuses in the Mexican government to export the worst of their population. It's really weird, but that's a side point. The idea though is to represent immigration as a criminal threat. A lot of people in this room are probably not aware of this, but this is an enormous issue on the right wing in the United States, which is the murder last year of Kate Steinle, a young woman in San Francisco who was shot dead by an undocumented Mexican in the city who, from all appearances, is perhaps very, very mentally ill as well, from all of the public statements that he's given. This has really become a lightning rod on the right, and the idea that if he had only been deported, if San Francisco had not been a so-called sanctuary city, that this woman who has become this rallying cry on the right would still be alive. It's the right, however, did not invent this sort of morphing of the idea of criminality and immigration that's playing such a big role on the Republican side this election cycle. You just have to look to the Obama administration and their program of secure communities, which was basically linking local police systems into the national immigration database so that undocumented immigrants picked up for any sort of crime could then be deported from the country. So in that way, I would argue that that the Obama administration and with the support of many Democrats has played a pernicious role in linking the idea of immigration and criminal threat together. And now with the last year's murder of Kate Steinle in San Francisco, there is, generally speaking, the Obama administration has used that to push for increased ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, collaboration with local law enforcement. There had been a lot of grassroots organizing in cities around the country in recent years against secure communities, basically saying, we don't want someone in our community because they're undocumented, afraid to call police because ICE is going to show up at their doorstep as a result. So cities all over the country broke ties with ICE. As a result, while Donald Trump and others have been demagoguing about Kate Steinle, the Obama administration has also been exploiting the tragedy, as well as Democrats like Dianne Feinstein in the Senate, to push localities to basically sign up for a new version of secure communities that is supposed to fix the problem of getting witnesses and low-level offenders caught up in the immigration system. But I haven't done that much research on it, but the advocates that I've spoken to are extremely unconvinced by this and just see it as secure communities all over again. Going back to Trump, I think it's also important to remember that he's a Frankenstein's monster of the Republican Party. I think there's on the one hand, it's great that there's so much protesting of him and condemnation of him, but a lot of the condemnation and protesting of him seems a little bit insincere, especially when you're hearing it on the right. I think that Republicans, the Republican establishment likes to pretend that it's critical of Trump because he makes these outrageous comments about Mexicans being rapists and barring Muslims from the country, or taking a very, very long time to disavow an endorsement from former KKK Grand Wizard David Duke. These are all bad things, and the Republican establishment likes to pretend that that's why they're critical of them. It seems to me that if you look closely at their statements and conversations about Donald Trump, that what freaks them out a lot more about him is the fact that can be a protectionist on trade issues and is embraces not privatizing Social Security. I would argue that those are the kind of things that truly freak out the Republican Party when it comes to Donald Trump. He's, after all, the Republican Party for the past decades has manipulated white fears and prejudices to get a significant chunk of white voters to go, working class and middle class white voters to go along with a pro-business agenda. And what Trump's doing in some sense is saying with a megaphone what they had always been whispering. So I don't take it very seriously when we hear these establishment Republican denunciations of Donald Trump. Turning to Rubio and Ted Cruz, might be Rubio's last day if he doesn't win Florida. I think that both of them show the limits of a sort of superficial, skin-deep identity politics. Not only are they bad on immigration reform, which polls and common sense suggest are very important to many Latino voters. Latino voters care about a lot of other issues as well that these two candidates are hostile towards. And I do agree that if immigration were taken off the table as an issue, if there was a legalization, that could very much benefit the Republican Party, but maybe not as much as they hope it would. I'm not sure that taking immigration off the table would suddenly lead more conservative-minded Republican Latinos into Republican arms, especially because of what seem to be more progressive economic and social preferences on behalf of young Latino voters that are more in tune with young voters of any race or color. In the Democratic primary, obviously, as has been discussed, Latinos are enormously important, or Hispanics, depending on what part of the country you're talking about. In Texas, Hispanic is the preferred term. And there's been a lot of commentary about the Sanders coalition being a heavily white one, and it is no doubt true that Sanders has done better amongst white voters, and Hillary Clinton no doubt blew him out amongst black voters in the South. But black voters in Michigan, for example, he got a lot closer, including fighting Hillary Clinton to a draw amongst black voters under 40. The Latino vote has also been somewhat mixed. In Texas, Sanders lost pretty badly to Clinton amongst Latino voters. But in Nevada, and I know I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts on these exit polls, Nevada exit polls showed that Sanders won amongst Latino voters. A lot of pundits quickly dismissed that because Hillary Clinton outperformed Sanders in majority Latino neighborhoods of Las Vegas. But an analysis by the Willie Velasquez Institute said, actually, the exit polls should be fine. The criticisms of the poll are wrong to say that just because she won the barrio, she won the Latino vote as a whole. Latinos live in all parts of Las Vegas and all over Nevada. But I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about that, because that's been controversial for a few weeks. And notably, in Illinois, which is holding its primary today, Sanders is down in the most recent poll that I read by 5 points amongst Latino voters. And he has the support of the city's most high-profile Latino politician, Chuy Garcia, who last year forced Mayor Rahm Emanuel into a runoff vote and then lost. And I think what's happening in Chicago amongst progressive whites, blacks, and Latinos is an attempt to build a multiracial progressive coalition, which is what Sanders needs to win. To the degree that this can happen in the North, it might show that Sanders' shortcomings in the South are not as catastrophic as they seemed. But today, as was mentioned earlier, will be very critical for Sanders' future. I think that is almost all I have to say. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for a fantastic set of interventions on this very important topic, foremost today with the Florida primaries. I want to just open up the floor for questions, comments, if anyone has, yes.
As mentioned in the Univision debate, Marco Rubio's proposed immigration plan would have the possibility, if it were to be made when his parents came into the United States, shutting them out by forcing education or other like specialized meritocratic form of immigration reform. So my question is, do Rubio and Cruz necessarily even want the Latino vote, or are they?
No. That's just my take on it. I think that they have. So it's unfair to say no, but writ large, it's not as important to them as is voters who are non-Latino, particularly white voters, right? And so it comes with a trade-off. If you want the white voters, then you have to take certain positions on immigration, which is going to alienate the Latino community, and therefore, you have to. It's a trade-off you have to make, and they're gambling on the side of the Republican base since they are Republican candidates. So it's not fair to say that they're not interested in the Latino vote. Rubio obviously is. He comes from Florida. He's depending on the Latino vote in Florida. If he were to pull off this miracle and become the Republican nominee, he would obviously want the state of Florida. He probably would need the state of Florida to win the election, and therefore the Latino electorate becomes more important to him. But generally speaking, I don't think that is as important to them as it is for the Democratic candidates.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, we've seen a lot of evidence that we haven't talked about today that something else the immigration issue does is push white Democrats towards the Republican Party. So to the extent that, as Domingo is saying, Rubio and Cruz are trying to appeal to potential white Republican voters or white nonpartisan or even conservative Democratic voters, it helps them with that group to come down hard against immigration reform.
Yeah, I think it really gets down to this fundamental contradiction in the Republican Party and what it needs to do to survive. It needs these kind of white xenophobic votes, but as this big postmortem they did after losing in 2012 shows, they need Latino votes to win. That's why we had Marco Rubio flirting with comprehensive immigration reform in 2013, and then pulling back and trying to disavow his own, past record with it. They can't do both, and it might destroy the party as we know it this year.
Yes.
Brought up a lot of interesting issues, but I just want to make one comment on Trump talking about criminals being sent here. That's not a new thing. It was certainly said about the Cubans when they were sent, that
Sure.
all the criminals and mentally unhealthy, and that's historical. But I don't want to talk about that. I'm wondering as a sort of exit poll question, what are the wedge issues for Latino voters? I assume right now we're talking so much about immigration, and you said if it was off the table. But in order for Reagan to see them as possible Republicans, that means what we've been told is Hispanics are more conservative, that the social issues are big issues. And some people have argued that's why the black vote goes for Hillary, because she's more conservative, obviously, than Sanders is. But I'm just wondering what those wedge issues would be that would make them the vote split or move over.
I mean, typically, when you ask Latinos, you see very, very strong feelings about immigration reform. But when you ask Latinos what the most important issue is to them personally, you see a lot of what you see with the rest of the population. So education, the economy, things like that. Immigration usually comes third or fourth. It's usually not considered the most important issue. But in terms of, there's a lot of debate over whether or not Reagan's statement is correct, right? But as you're saying, the socially conservative issues, so abortion in particular has been one in which the Republican Party has thought that Latinos who are predominantly Catholic might be possible to appeal to them on that issue. I think until recently, same-sex marriage, we've seen increasing support within the Latino community for same-sex marriage, but that hasn't always been the case. So those sorts of social issues have been seen as ones in which the Latino community might be winnable. And I think the evidence suggests that, as my colleagues have said, that is not necessarily the case, that even if we did take immigration off the table, when we think about Republican policy on education and on jobs and other issues, that those are increasingly policies that are not compatible with Latino views.
Yes.
I want to set forth a general fact. Voting is not easy.
Hmm.
And I would judge that by the number of attendees in this room, they may not realize that there's certain deadlines for getting a mail ballot application. Each state sets its own rules. In our own wonderful state of Rhode Island, we have a photo ID law to contend with. So I can only suggest that don't wake up on primary or general election day in your state and find out you're unable to vote. So pay attention.
Yeah, you have to register, I think, within like a week and a half of now to vote in the Rhode Island primary or something like that.
27th.
Yeah,
Deadline
27th,
in Rhode
yeah.
Island, but each state is different.
That, you didn't ask the question, but I think, it does lead to another very important conversation, which we haven't had yet, and it's about voter identification and laws that make it more difficult for people to participate in the electoral process. And we see this happening in states like North Carolina and states like Indiana. Rhode Island is very interesting. I mean, we could get to Rhode Island now. We can talk about how Rhode Island fits or doesn't fit into this larger discussion. But part of the reason why we may see that this is happening, and indeed research has shown, is that when you get the growth of the other, whether it's Latino or African Americans, and you have Republican-led state legislatures and governors, they're more likely to pass these types of laws. And so there's a reason that they're trying to pass these laws. If the Republican Party is not changing its way or opening up its arms through policies, they have to do it another way. And so in many cases, this is the other way.
Yes.
Two questions. Why is it so hard to get the Hispanics to register in Texas? We should be winning Texas by now. We're not close. And the second question is, who's going to be the Latino Hispanic vice presidential candidate on the Democratic Party? I give up on the Republican Party, but on the Democratic.
On the vice presidential candidate, I don't think there's going to be a Latina this year. I think the best chance for a Latino would be, what's his name?
Castro.
Julian Castro. But my prediction, and I could be wrong, but I'm making this prediction frequently and clearly now, so I can get credit if I'm right, which is that Hillary's one way to even get close to winning over Sanders supporters who really do not like her would be an Elizabeth Warren pick. That's my guess.
That would be interesting. I think she needs like a Joe Biden, right? If Joe Biden would be willing to do it again, she needs. If you look at the constituency, the demographic that she's not doing very well, and it's the white male who may be angry, as we've all talked about, the kind of sort of whatever, and so. Is there a candidate out there, a vice presidential candidate out there that may help with that demographic? I think it'll be very interesting. I think I say Joe Biden because that's what Obama leaned on, and that's who Obama leaned on. And is there someone else similar? Julian Castro, if it was Rubio the nominee, even maybe Ted Cruz the nominee, then I could clearly see that would be the move. Right now, since it looks like it's going to be Donald Trump, I'm not as sure that that's the case. I think
Yeah.
it would still be a wise decision, but I don't necessarily think that it will be the decision.
Ironically, it works against him, I think. Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, on the Republican side, you've heard some people say, well, would it help? I mean, Trump has said, he's indicated that if he wins the nomination, he hopes to pick a vice president from the establishment, so someone who has experience in politics. And I've heard, it would be difficult for me to imagine her accepting it, but Susana Martinez, who's the very popular Republican governor of New Mexico. Yeah, and in terms of the Texas question, I mean, I would say more generally, I think it's difficult to get people to register to vote in a context that's not seen as competitive, right? So if you are in a state that is very conservative and you feel like it doesn't matter if you go to the polls, that your vote isn't going to make a difference. Back to the earlier point that it takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of time, you have to know where to register, then I think that's a context not only for Latinos, but also generally where we see lower levels of registration.
What is the percentage of Hispanic people in Texas?
I don't know off the top
That's
of my head. Do you know?
I want to say it's somewhere like 16, 17%, but I might be wrong.
I mean,
16 to 17?
I think, but I might be wrong.
I would also say in Texas you have a lot of, so I started my talk talking about diversity by national origin, but you also have a very homogeneous Latino community in terms of how long people have been here, and we know that for later generation immigrants, so people, even people who were here when the U.S. took over Texas, immigration issues don't matter as much to them. So I think that the actual percentage of Latinos in Texas might belie some of that diversity as well.
You know, along those lines too, I think it's important, this point about whether you think your vote is going to make a difference. Obviously, you know, political efficacy has an effect on whether you're going to turn out to vote or not. And what we do see happening is in states where there's a heavy concentration of Latinos, like California, like New York, Florida's it's an outlier when it comes to this. But most of these states are going to be either solid blue, like California, like New York, or in the case of Texas, solid red. And so it may be that because the decision is already being made in so many ways, that it turns down, it has a negative effect on voter turnout. That's just one reason why we may see Latinos not turning out in numbers as one would imagine.
Just to add on piggyback on what Domingo was saying, I was very hopeful of all the figures that you showed, Domingo, and as well as Heather's, because the future of the country seems to be Hispanic in many ways. No, it's the second generation is very, very young, and I'm wondering that besides the difficulty of registering to vote, what other reasons make young voters not vote? There's this big mass of possible voters that don't go out to the polls. Why do you think is that? We have many young voters here. What do you think that is?
Well, so for one, the young voters that we have here, one of the major problems that we have is states making it more difficult for students to be able to vote in their home states. And so generally we see the states that are most friendly to students are those who are leaning Democratic, right? States like Oregon, right? And so they don't have much to lose in terms of having young voters participate in the process because they tend to lean more Democratic. But some states make it very difficult for students to register to vote. And so for the young population, those that we have particularly here at Brown University, that may be one of their challenges. Yeah. Other challenges, voting is it's a task. And if you just include one obstacle, it increases significantly the likelihood that you're not going to turn out to vote. And so young people, they have a lot of other things that they're thinking about besides voting. And in addition to that, may feel like they may not be able to influence the process the way that others think. Or that the process, even if they do participate, that the process is not going to be lead to the type of results that they're looking for. And that all has an effect on turnout.
The numbers that were put up earlier showed, you know, much lower turnout amongst Latinos than white or Black Americans, but there's also data showing that turnout gets lower and lower and lower and lower as you go down the income ladder. And I think that there's a profound alienation amongst poor people of all races and ethnicities in this country when it comes to the political process, because whether it's under Reagan or under Bush or under Clinton and then Bush again, it's not that there's no differences between these people, but the basic economic contours of their lives didn't really change much. There was a general trend orientation by both parties towards business and away from labor. And poor communities. Another part of that has been the decimation of labor unions and other sorts of community level organizations that organically connected people to politics. So people feel disconnected from and ignorant of politics in the sense that they don't have a direct way to relate to them in many cases.
Yes.
I was hoping some of you could comment on the effects of Donald Trump's hate speech on communities of color. And I mean, you were talking about Latinos, so if you want to make that specific. So, I mean, I've been seeing a lot of, videos. There's a lot of circulation of these snippets of say, a Donald Trump rally and like violence that goes between the supporters and those who are trying to protest, but also the effects that it's having on communities, say, for children in school, for young teens or adults, and even just had a conversation the other day with someone in Providence saying that in the bank there was an altercation with two people when she was there, and there was this comment made of questioning her nationality, and she is a born citizen of the U.S., but is a Latina, and so thinking how it's coming to it's reaching so deeply into this animosity between communities, and I personally have had a very sad and almost depressive experience just seeing all of these things and hearing about it, and I wondered if you had any comments on it, or how to respond, or what ways in which to have some care towards and attention brought more to this issue.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's easy for me to get carried away with me enjoying watching Donald Trump blow up the Republican Party, but it's important to keep in mind that he's saying dangerous things about real people, and I think particularly worrisome is incitement to violence against Muslim Americans, against all sorts of non-white, non-Christian Americans. But I really, from the numbers I've seen around incidents, that seems the most worrying, and that you're right to be worried. It's worrying.
One of the sad things about our society and American politics and demographics is that we're a highly segregated society, and because we're highly segregated, we probably don't see as much violence as we could see, because people are just not around each other in these ways, right? So if you're in a Latino community, Black community, the chances of you seeing whites it's just very low. And so the type of encounters that you're describing, while they're certainly capture our attention, I do think that because of our segregation issue here in the United States, it's probably not as bad as it probably could be. And so to the question about what can be done, I mean, so we need to think about the places where we do have encounters, where we do have multiracial groups coming together to try to create conversations and minimize the hostility. And so college campuses is obviously an important place to have these types of conversations, and other places where people come together and have conversations, because we do need to think about the implications beyond electoral politics and how this is really affecting people's lives and how people are getting hurt. And so the Muslim attack on Muslim communities, for example, is one glaring issue. And so I think as we think about solutions, the solution is not at the national level, it's not in terms of presidential politics. I think it is with communities, and particularly in spaces where you have multiracial groups, people coming together to come up with their own solutions to try to minimize the hostility.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I think the example that Domingo gave in his talk of all the communities of color coming together in Chicago is really powerful. And I think that to the extent that the press starts to cover those stories more, the Boston Globe had a story last week about people who were yelling racial slurs at a basketball game, and they got escorted out of the game, right? And I think that to the extent that we start to see more people standing up to this language, and also more news coverage of the other side of it, it could, I mean, ultimately lend to some sense of empowerment as well. Certainly not the way we would want to see empowerment, but I think that it could also result in some coalition building and people asserting their rights.
And I do think that actually defeating this sort of racist, xenophobic, nationalist movement will take more than saying that it's wrong, and people should say that it's wrong. But there is a lot of anger in this country, and has been mentioned particularly amongst white working class men. Some of the anger is legitimate about economic stagnation and decline, and some of it is misdirected with the assistance of people like Donald Trump towards stigmatized others. And I think it really will take multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, progressive movements that answer the needs of all of these different people, including the angry white working class men, to be a real solution. I don't think saying no is enough.
Yeah, I was talking earlier with Dan as well that Donald Trump seems eerily familiar to Latin Americans in the populism and the encouragement of violence as the ultimate political alliance baptized by blood. No, if you commit a crime on my behalf, you're going to be my follower forever. Where Latin Americans are very used to that sort of political speech, and he is definitely building on that sentiment, and we have to fight that. No, it's, what Dan is saying: more diversity, more discussion, more nuance, than not just segmenting and seeing people fight against each other.
And yeah, I mean, I'm just completely laying my primary cards on the table here, but I think there's a major danger in the general election strategy that Hillary Clinton has telegraphed, a signal that she will use against Donald Trump is recently, that for every white working class male the Democratic Party loses, she's going to pick up 2 socially moderate, affluent white suburbanites. That for me is not. That is a non-solution that instead of attempting to meet these people's economic needs is doubling down on the same sort of policies that have destroyed white working class communities and driven them away from the Democratic Party and towards Trump in the first place, that created Trump. So I think that's bad news.
Yes.
About what this gentleman said earlier, first of all, the Texas Hispanic population is about 38%.
Wow.
It's actually
Okay.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Google.
also I was just wondering, as these primaries continue, and since Bernie Sanders had that 49% sort of unknown factor within the Latino community, does he need to win more states to gain more recognition, or what else? What is, do you think, the leading factor for him to gain more recognition in the Latino community, and to a further extent to just people of color in general?
Well, he's down 5% in Illinois, so we'll know later tonight or tomorrow once the exit polls are released how he did. But it's definitely looks like a different performance than in Texas. And as has been stated many times, the Latino and Hispanic communities are incredibly heterogeneous. So it could be because the Texas and Illinois are different communities, or it could also be because the ground is shifting during the campaign.
It can be. I think it's a combination of factors. First, I would like to suggest that we need to be careful about the polls, right? The polls were off in Michigan, right? And even in Mississippi, where Hillary Clinton won by 20%, the polls were wrong there as well. So we need to think cautiously about what the polls may show. I do think that Bernie Sanders just had a disadvantage compared to Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton has been part of our political discussion now for 20 years, and so, or more. And Bernie Sanders, particularly for Black communities, Latino communities, he's new, and it takes time to get to know the candidate. And so because I think they've gotten to know the candidate better, you start to see African Americans and perhaps Latinos voting, supporting him more. The question is it going to be enough? Right now, the numbers suggest that his time is running out, and he would need to change this pretty quickly. And looking ahead, the way that Latino voters and African American voters have been supporting Hillary Clinton, it would take a drastic turn of events for him to get the support. But he's making inroads. It's just his time on his side. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pick up on something that Domingo was saying about being cautious of the polls, especially within the Latino population. I would be very careful about where I get information about that population. So a lot of the information that I presented was from Latino Decisions, which is run by Latino political scientists. I'd be very skeptical of a lot of the other polls about the Latino population because it's such a difficult population to poll. We see a lot of differences. A lot of the polls of Latinos don't include Spanish speakers, and we see a lot of differences between attitudes of Spanish speakers and English speakers. Danielle referred to some of the questions of the polls in Nevada, and I don't actually know the report that you're familiar with, but I'll say a couple things. So one that we know generally drives candidates, and I think we're seeing it with Sanders, is this question of momentum, right? So when candidates start to do well, people take a second look at them, their name recognition goes up, people start to pay attention. And also the mobilization, the ground operation, so having people go out, knock on doors. In the lead up to Nevada, there were a lot of stories about Sanders' ground operation targeting specifically the Latino community. And that is an investment that takes a long time for a lot of candidates. It's not feasible to do in every state, and it's not something that you can sort of pull together at the last minute, right? So getting to Domingo's point about time.
And, sorry. Just one other thing to note that I think is interesting is that in Dearborn, Michigan, which is sort of the capital of Arab America, Sanders won pretty decisively against Clinton, which that's not with regard to Latinos, but it does relate to the Trump issue, and I think blows up a lot of stereotypes about what that community is like.
Yes.
I heard on NPR that Illinois represents the best cross-section of America. Everybody's represented in Illinois, so it'll be very interesting to see how that primary goes,
Interesting.
percentage-wise.
With Florida too. And if nobody else has a question, I have a question, but I don't want to ask it if a student has a question.
No, are you sure? We both can ask questions.
Yeah,
We
go
don't
ahead.
have to
I'm going to
choose.
defer to the student in case we run out of time. Go ahead.
No, we have time for 2 questions. Yeah, that's perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, so this, and I'm being facetious here, but I'd like to hear your comments. My name is Sean Connor, and that's a very American name. And people come up to me frequently and say, oh, that's a nice Irish name, and it hurts my feelings. And so I say, no. That's a really nice American name. It's an American name like Rubenstein and Rockefeller. So please, So why are we having this difficulty between Latinos and Hispanics? What is the name? Because on one of, and you have a wonderful name, Heather. You'd never, I mean, that's why I love America so much, right? You'd never expect that you're Hispanic with your name, but that's okay, because that's a great American name. So is it a problem for us that there are 2 different ways of referring to Americans who have some sort of, let's call it Spanish ancestry? Do we divide by calling them sometimes Latinos and sometimes Hispanics? Is there a preferred word? Will they get more political power if they can consolidate under a name? I'm curious, this is an ad hominem question.
Well, so I don't think that if we're able to, pick one over the other, that it may have a significant effect on power or the way that they're perceived or any other, associations that, questions that you had regarding the power of that name. I do think that it's, as a matter of preference, as Daniel had mentioned earlier, in the South, particularly in Texas, they use the word Hispanic more often. In the North, we use Northeast specifically, we use Latino more often. And so, I just think it's a matter of, the vernacular and where you find yourself. And I think it's part of the, the greatness of being a diverse group in America. And so, I don't know what the future looks like in terms of terminology, if one would, will be used more than the other, or one will completely disappear. But up to this point, and I say this as a scholar and someone who worked on Latino/Hispanic mobilization, I don't really think it makes a difference. My view on it.
Well, also
Percent.
Hispanic may refer more to the language spoken, to Spanish America, of a Spanish American descent. And Latino can also include Brazilian and Portuguese
And indigenous.
and indigenous descent. So, but I mean, in political terms, just like as Domingo is saying, it doesn't make much of a difference. I see it that way, Hispanic or Latino. Yes, you wanted to comment on that?
Comments on it. I mean, you have to think about it in historical terms. Hispanic was a political construction under the census back in, do you know the year? It was
like
in the
about
50s, 60s. Around the 60s was the first time that Hispanic came out to categorize this group of people. And I think as Professor Martinez Pinzon referenced, it has to do with language and the language history. And actually, one term I think that is even used here in the East Coast and that I hadn't heard coming from California was the terminology of Spanish. So
Yeah,
there are
in New
people
York especially.
who use the term Spanish, and I think that, along with Hispanic, has been historically in the discourse of marginalization and oppression. And there is, I mean, personally working with communities, this preference of Latino, and now a new term, Latinx, to not assign gender to the term, to include more people under this terminology, and the inclusion of Brazilians, Native and indigenous communities, as well as the Caribbean, thinking about Haiti, for example, under Latinx. But I think while the politicians, academics, and many publications, written publications, don't have a preference for either term, I think when you look at community, and I'm sure there is work around the use of different terminology, and I think there is an importance, and I would suggest there would be some political implications, at least within community organizing and within people coming together, of having a preference, because while, like I said, in written work they might be interchangeable, I think when you talk to someone who has a strong preference for Hispanic, they will have a strong argument for not using Latino. And now thinking about that, the exclusion of or the degenderizing term Latinx, there will probably be more arguments against that. There has already been this idea of kind of picking apart the language, Spanish as a language, by taking away gender, because it's such a part of how the language is spoken. So there is already an argument against the use of Latinx. So I would invite you to look up more information, because I venture to say that there is a lot, and there is a lot of debate over the use of these terms.
I would say there is research, as you're suggesting, that there are characteristics that make people clearly prefer one versus another, right? So region is one that we know. There are other things. But I think in terms of the question about organizing, I think the bigger question, at least that we look at as political scientists, is whether or not the community will come together around common interests, right? And whether the community will see themselves as a group that has shared interests and shared political goals. And to some extent, for that question, I think you could still use them interchangeably, as Domingo was saying.
I think so too. By introducing Latinx, I think adds another dimension to it, right? And I do think that adds a more complicated conversation, and people deciding that this is the preferred terminology. I think politically we might see changes, because here we're talking not only about identity, not only about race, gender in very specific ways. So it may be that is the case. I do want to say something about whether we use Hispanic or Latino. Something very important. So for a long time, so like let's say in Chicano communities, right? Chicano doesn't suggest at all Latino at all. It's, we're talking about a Mexican American specificity there, right? As these communities become more diverse, then the question whether you're just Mexican, American, or whether you're just Cuban or Latino, I think that has significant political implications. And so I think of, for example, Pitbull, the Cuban American rapper from Florida. For him, you know, Cubans have not been known to be vocal on the question of immigration. But Pitbull very much became an advocate for pro-immigration, particularly against Donald Trump and his rhetoric, right? And so he adopted not a Cuban American position here, he adopted, and you hear him clearly saying, a Latino position here, that Latinos are against Trump. And so in this particular case, not that there's a differentiation here between Hispanic and Latino, the idea of a pan-ethnic Latino or Hispanic identity, I think that is very powerful politically. And I think Pitbull is one example of
Yeah, if I'm gonna add something that's very inspiring, and if you look at the history of the name, many people adopted it back in the 50s and 60s as an awakening of class consciousness. I'm gonna see this as a interclass alliance of different ethnicities. So you can look at the Latino and Latinx as a resurgence of class consciousness and looking at what place, not as a division, but as a unity amongst different Latin American ethnicities under one agenda. No, and that was a beautiful picture that you showed us, Domingo, of the African American with the Mexican American coming together in a political mission. No? But you wanted to ask something.
Yeah, just a quick question. I feel like usually in this election and talking about descriptive versus substantive representation, it's usually talking about sort of Hillary and feminists in different eras and so on. But I'm curious, I also have an extensive Cuban family network of kind of Republicans slowly becoming more democratic and keeping with national trends.
the American way.
And I feel like what I hear very often from some members of that community are that about both Rubio and Cruz is that they're traitors. This kind of feeling of being a traitor and how that kind of, and I'm curious how you think that ties into this idea of kind of descriptive versus substantive representation, them not actually catering to the Latino vote. How do you think that relationship has become more complicated?
I mean, I think that Cruz and Rubio in general have complicated a lot of our understandings about descriptive representation. So as I was saying in the talk, we know that typically having someone of your same race or ethnicity or gender on the ticket promotes turnout and I mean, not across the board within the Latino community. What we see within the Latino community is that usually race ethnicity is seen as sort of a shortcut or a cue, right? In the same way that gender or political party is. And I think that what we're seeing in this election is that party is a bigger cue, which we already sort of knew, that party is a bigger cue for people than race, ethnicity, or gender, right? And then I think within that, especially on the Democratic side, we're also seeing this sense of the question of how far the cue matters, right? So is it that people take in political science, we talk about information shortcuts, like people don't educate themselves as voters, they just go straight to the shortcut of party. So people who advocate for that would expect that we'd see across the board women coming out in support of Hillary Clinton, for instance. I mean, I think that we're seeing potentially more sophisticated decisions being made by voters if they're not just immediately going to these more superficial cues.
Black voters have made these sorts of decisions for years, from Alan Keyes to Herman Cain to now Ben Carson. I don't think there was ever like a big threat that any of these candidates were gonna pull off a significant chunk of the black vote.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that what we see over time is partisanship and ideology resonating more than a simplistic descriptive representation. Not that that doesn't matter, right? But I think that we're seeing it being qualified.
I'm just curious, so when you say traitor, Cruz and Rubio, that is, so what part of the population is saying this? Are you're talking about your Cuban family that is still Republican or transitioning to Democrat? I'm curious as to who would consider them.
I mean, I would say that, or I've seen, I think, in the kind of communities in which I've seen, kind of it is very generational in terms of kind of grandparents being still pretty right, parents being in between, and then our generation of Cuban Americans being pretty left. Those are general, obviously I say that as kind of a general trend. But I think in the group that is transitioning, and I think that's really interesting. And I don't know if it's because of, obviously, I forget, we just mentioned it, of Rubio or Cruz, that the policy that he would talk about wouldn't have let his own grandparents into the country, I wonder if that's kind of a factor in it as well. Kind of thinking you would let my parents in, if you would let in your own, that feeling.
Because I would think that Rubio specifically his policies fit neatly within the older Cuban American voting preferences or ideology in Florida. So I don't think that population would consider him a traitor. I think other Latinos would, and certainly perhaps maybe the younger generation would. And I think across the board, Cruz, not a lot of people like him, whether Latinos or not. And so, yeah.
And I think that what you are seeing actually resonates with what we know about the Cuban attitudes, right? So, as you're saying, older generations tend to be much more conservative and much more focused on Castro and the Cuba relationship, whereas for maybe our generation or your generation, that Cuba and Castro and the experience of leaving Cuba and coming to the United States hasn't played such a central role and isn't as defining in one's political worldview.
Yeah, and also going back to the fact of class consciousness, that word that's never used. I'm gonna pick that up again in the sense of Rubio and Cruz seem to come down from the sky for certain segment of the Latino and Hispanic population. It's very much as Trump comes down in his airplane. There's no way of identifying with the experience of Rubio and Cruz as coming from working class immigrant families. So it's beyond Spanish language that the discussion tends to go.
And I'm not sure how this, I'd be interested to hear what you guys have to say about this in terms of how the idea of like the special kind of immigration privilege for Cubans, I think probably rubs a lot of Latinos who didn't just automatically get legalized when they touched the sand. Probably rubs in the wrong way.
Well, I do think that has an effect. It has an effect, I think, because if you are going to be embracing policies that are harsh on immigrant populations, and you are Latino, and yet you had a special, a unique circumstance compared to other Latinos, it can be seen. This is why I asked the question about who's considering him a traitor. I think in order to consider somebody like Rubio or Cruz traitors, you must, number one, identify as a Latino, and two, think that the Latino experience is somehow tied to a particular immigrant experience, where Rubio and Cruz, their immigrant experience has been very different.
It's also, we haven't talked about this yet, interesting that foreign policy towards Latin America has come up recently in the campaign, both with Sanders being criticized for his past statements praising the Cuban Revolution, and also Sanders criticizing the sort of foreign policy establishment and Reagan's support for dirty wars in Central America. And I'm guessing that's somewhat with an eye towards older Cuban voters, but probably more just towards conservative voters in general.
Perhaps.
Well, thank you everyone for coming in today. It was a wonderful discussion. Let's see what happens in Florida and Ohio today. Wonderful.